Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Max Dupuis, and I am a principal with the Regulatory Assistance Project, also known as RAP. I'll be your host today, and I'm joined by three colleagues. We have Fritz Karl, who is a senior advisor at RAP and also wears other hats, including at his own consulting firm called Third Rail. We also have Carl Lindberg, who's a principal at RAP, and we have Lauren Schweisberg, who is the manager of the carbon-free electricity practice at RMI. Before we get started, I'll mention a few logistical details. Because there are a large number of attendees, we will keep all of you muted. You can submit questions in the question pane. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. We encourage you to submit questions. The webinar will run at first for 60 minutes, but we'll stay on for an additional half hour for a total of 90 minutes if there are more questions. And you should also know that this webinar is being recorded. In a few days, we'll send you a link to the recording and the slides. Today's webinar is motivated by some big changes that are going on in the power sector and the need to make sure that the practices of utilities and regulators are coming to grips with those changes. Now, many of these big changes are familiar to the audience today. One very important change is that the costs of wind generation and solar generation have declined dramatically. Today, in many cases, the cost of building new solar and wind generation capacity is now lower than the cost of fueling and operating existing coal-fired and even gas-fired generation plants. This is, of course, a really dramatic change, and it's a big motivator for our discussion today. In addition, the growth of distributed energy resources and the growth of electrification means that the demand side is also changing and opening up new opportunities to reduce costs, to reduce emissions, and support reliability and resilience. And meanwhile, we have increasingly stringent climate goals at the state and now federal levels. The question is, are utilities and regulators keeping up with these opportunities and challenges? And I think the answer is that probably every utility commission and every utility can do more to get more out of these lower cost renewable resources that are available today. This is particularly true for regulated vertically integrated utilities. And I can put it this way, the world is changing dramatically. New wind and new solar, as I mentioned, are may now be cheaper than the operating costs of coal and gas plants in many cases. But if regulation doesn't change dramatically as well, then regulated utilities may tend to go along as before, missing out on cost savings and emission reduction opportunities. Now, today we're going to really focus in on procurement practices. And in particular, we're going to draw on two recent papers, which are available on our RAP website. We have a joint RMI RAP paper, which is called How to Build Clean Energy Portfolios, a practical guide to next generation procurement practices, to which Lauren and Carl both contributed. And we also have a paper written by Fritz and myself that offers a kind of a wider view of various strategies, which is called Getting the Most Out of Low-Cost Solar and Wind, 7 Strategies for State Regulators. And I'd also like to recommend a page on RMI's website that has a lot more information on related subjects. And you should see the links visible now in the chat box to some of these resources I just mentioned. I'll also note that we're planning a follow-up webinar in the next month or two that will feature people with hands-on experience with these procurement strategies. We'll send more information on that soon when we've settled on a date. And at this point, I'll turn the mic over to Fritz, who will give some history of how we got where we are today, and who will give an overview of how to upgrade procurement practices. Fritz?
Thank you, Max. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Wanted to build off of Max's opening remarks, this idea that the electricity industry and the energy sector more broadly is in a period of rapid and fundamental change, and that utility regulation, and by extension, state regulatory commissions, will play a central role in how the industry manages this transition to electricity and energy systems of the future. put this idea in context, roughly 60% of electricity sales in the US are made by regulated vertically integrated utilities. And despite the fact that we talk a lot about organized markets, the reality is that most investment in new resources, both on the supply side and on the demand side, is being shaped by regulated utilities through planning, procurement, and programs. Even in states that have competitive retail services, regulators have a significant impact on state resource mixes through utility programs. This is not the first time that regulators have had to think critically about the design and implementation of utility planning and procurement. A lot of the recent discussion on utility procurement and program design has its roots in state experimentation with competitive procurement and the development of demand-side programs in the 1980s. At the time, regulators were dealing with rising utility costs and rates, falling costs of natural gas-fired generation, and a growing realization that demand-side programs could lower customer bills. Broadly, regulators at the time sought to design utility procurement and programs in ways that would produce results consistent with competitive outcomes and align utility incentives with public policy goals. Next slide, please. This emphasis on incentive alignment and competitive outcomes is still top of mind for utility regulators in many states, but the landscape that we now face is arguably much more complex than what we faced in the 1980s for several reasons. First, the electricity sector faces a host of new challenges, which means that our goals are evolving. In the 1980s, commissions and utilities viewed the world primarily in terms of reliability and cost, but many states have since had a proliferation of goals for the electricity sector: equity and affordability, decarbonization, resilience, electrification, distributed energy, cybersecurity, and a number of others. In many cases, we still need ways to better and more coherently orient utility planning and procurement around these emerging goals. Second, we've had large reductions in technology costs for solar PV, wind, and battery storage that have consistently outpaced expectations over the last decade. Third, these resources, solar, wind, and batteries, also have very different operating characteristics and system values than many of the resources we're used to. For solar and wind, their economics depend critically on things like siting, financing, and curtailment risk. And in practice, we've seen that planning assumptions around these parameters can depart significantly from practice in the real world. Higher penetrations of solar, wind, and storage also require some changes in how we think about resource adequacy and reliability. In addition, solar, wind, and batteries have more interactive effects than traditional resources. Interactive means that the value of one kind of resource will depend on the penetrations of another. Solar PV provides a really great example of these interactive effects. In places like California, as rising PV penetrations start to shift net peak demand, it increases the capacity value of wind. In California, we've also seen this really interesting interaction between PV and battery costs. Falling solar PV costs will make PV curtailment more cost effective, but falling battery costs will also make batteries and less curtailment more cost effective. And then for battery storage, we can locate it anywhere in the electricity system, from behind the meter to the primary distribution system, to the sub-transmission system, to the high voltage transmission system. So figuring out where to most effectively locate storage means that when utilities value storage in planning, procurement, and programs, we need to make sure that these evaluations accurately reflect the value that storage provides in different locations across the electricity system. Fourth big change is that we also have a greater value and more opportunities for system flexibility, particularly on the demand side. This greater emphasis on flexibility requires thinking about some values that we've traditionally ignored in planning and evaluation, including real-time energy and congestion management on the distribution and transmission systems. For instance, this question about where to put storage in our electricity system will be mainly shaped by the value of deferring or avoiding distribution and transmission capital investments. And then lastly, we have significant new opportunities for using information technology all over electricity networks, from generation facilities to the transmission and distribution grids, and even behind the meter for optimizing load. And using information technology in ways that can increase distribution reliability and make more efficient use of the transmission and distribution equipment that we already have. A lot of the regulatory organization of these considerations has been under grid modernization proceedings so far, but it isn't necessarily that well integrated with utility planning, investment procurement, and programs. All of this suggests that we need to upgrade utility planning, procurement, and programs to better adapt to changing market conditions, to better incorporate uncertainty around demand growth and supply costs, to better capture interactive effects among resources and between resources on the distribution system and on the transmission system, and then to coordinate among different planning processes to make sure that these processes aren't working at cross purposes. Regulators in all states play a very important role in guiding and encouraging utilities to make these kinds of upgrades, whether that's through IRP rules or dedicated dockets with commission guidance. This guidance is what helps keep utility planning, procurement, and programs in line with changing market conditions and evolving public policy goals. Upgrading utility planning, procurement, and programs requires attention in a few key areas. First, a clear articulation by commissions on public policy goals and alignment by commissions and utilities on what that implies for procurement and programs. This includes thinking about the need in procurement. So for instance, if the cost of wind and solar bids in some jurisdictions is lower than the operating cost of existing thermal units, utilities should be procuring some amount of wind and solar, even if they don't have a resource adequacy need. This is a form of economic need rather than a traditional reliability need. And these kinds of costs can, procuring in this way can lower costs for customers. Second thing that's implied by keeping these upgrades is better integration of planning, procurement, and programs. This means recognizing that utility program planning, procurement, programs are in fact different parts of a single process. That planning will shape procurement and procurement will shape planning, for instance. Third is a shift to all source procurement. This means allowing utilities to determine least cost portfolios within boundaries set by commissions and determining least cost portfolios across a broad range of resources and including supply and demand side resources. Fourth is strengthening the competitive design of procurement process. And this means spending the time to develop robust competitive procurement processes, but also continuing to evaluate and adjust them as time goes on. For all source procurement, one of the most important design issues is the use of independent evaluators. This goes hand in hand with allowing utilities to have greater flexibility in procurement. Fifth is improving utility methods, modeling, and metrics for resource planning and evaluating bids and procurement. And the two main areas for improvement are probably resource adequacy metrics and methods and building out more but still a manageable level of spatial and temporal detail and models that utilities use to evaluate resources in planning and procurement. There's a lot going on in this space right now at EPRI and the national labs, but also with individual utilities. And it's important for commissions to make sure that utilities are keeping up with state of the art. And then lastly, better management of risks through how utilities incorporate uncertainty into planning and procurement, and things like load forecast, resource costs, and future value. This may imply changes in the design of planning and procurement process, for instance, shortening the gap between planning and procurement cycles. But it also implies changes in the way that utilities plan. For instance, planning around scenarios rather than point estimates, incorporating the option value of smaller and more modular resources into resource planning and procurement, and building some more flexibility into procurement. So what are different jurisdictions doing to deal with these challenges? I'm going to pass over to Lauren and Carl to walk us through some concrete examples.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fritz. And we can go to the next slide. So as Max mentioned in the opening of the webinar today, one of the foundations for our presentation today is research that we shared in our report, How to Build Clean Energy Portfolios, that both Carl and the RMI team worked on. And the chart that's on this slide is in that report as well, if you want to take a closer look. One of the first questions we really sought to answer with our research was, what are the outcomes that we're seeing in jurisdictions that are already using some of the changes that Fritz just mentioned in their procurement processes, particularly the shift to all source procurement? We wanted to better understand if shifting towards an all source process is actually enabling utilities to capture some of the benefits that Max mentioned of low cost renewable and storage resources in line with the market trends that we're seeing. Based on this chart, the answer that we found was a pretty resounding yes. in our look across about 11 examples of processes that were incorporating some of these key elements. We wanted across the over 10 gigawatts of investments we analyzed in our research resulting from all source procurement processes, we found that utilities were selecting a majority of solar, wind, and storage at record low prices in many cases. Where any gas was selected, and you can see a small bit of both new and existing gas at the end of the right bar chart there. It was either short-term contracts with existing generators or a much smaller quantity than originally anticipated, which was the case in Glendale, which Carl's can talk a little bit more about. This element of surprise is actually really key to what we're seeing as an outcome here. The market prices have been changing so rapidly that really they've been consistently beating utilities' expectations. So all source procurement has provided a way to ask for the most up-to-date market information. With that intro, I'm going to hand it over to Carl to tell us a little bit more about a few of these examples in these bars in more detail.
Thank you, Lauren. Now let's dig into a couple of examples that illustrate how all source procurement is already producing clean energy outcomes. I'm going to start with El Paso energy procurement. An assessment of need in 2017 led to a forecast of need in 2022 and 2023. This growth in need was associated with some gas retirements, as well as a modest amount of growth in service required. The competitive solicitation was focused on 50 megawatt need in 2022 and an additional 320 megawatt need in 2023. El Paso Energy, or EPE, opened a competitive solicitation to identify projects to fill the projected need, and 88 bids were received. EPE identified 2 projects that stood out: the 100 megawatt Hecate solar project, which priced out at $15 a megawatt hour, and the Buena Vista 50 megawatt solar, 50 megawatt storage project, which priced out at $21 per megawatt hour with a 5% per kilowatt capacity charge. And PRC regulators approved these projects in 2020. EPE had also identified 228 megawatts of gas peakers and a second storage project that was a standalone storage project for consideration by PRC, but these did not go forward. With the New Mexico legislature passing a carbon-free by 2045 goal in its 2019 session, state policy supported consideration of the carbon-free options that were selected. As I said, the PRC ultimately rejected EPE's proposal for a 228 megawatt gas plant, finding that approving the gas plant at this time was at odds with the direction of New Mexico's state energy policy. So while Texas ratepayers will be paying for this plant because the Texas Commission approved it in a EPE proposal, New Mexico's ratepayers will not. Next slide, please. Our second example comes from a public power utility in Glendale, California. The example is notable for several interesting reasons and for an interesting, diverse portfolio that did include demand-side options. Initially, in 2015, Glendale started with a proposal to its city council to repower an existing gas facility at an estimated cost of $350 million. The city council requested that Glendale reconsider and consider an all-source portfolio that could displace the need to repower that 250 megawatt Grayson facility. The 2018 Glendale RFP that resulted is notable for seeking bids from utility scale and demand side resource solutions. The RFP generated 34 responses, with the ultimate winning bids enabling a solution that saved Glendale residents $125 million relative to that originally proposed $350 million Grayson repower. The Glendale portfolio included a much smaller gas addition than originally proposed and is notable in its using a portfolio of energy efficiency, demand response, distributed PV, and storage, along with utility scale solar and wind. The resources ultimately approved included, as shown on this slide, some utility scale resources, gas, utility scale solar, and wind, as well as 28 megawatts of EE and DR, 23 megawatts of distributed PV, and 75 megawatts of storage. The EPE and Glendale examples show that all source procurement portfolios are already emerging. But best practices are still emerging. The Clean Energy Portfolio Report and website identify best practices for utilities and regulators seeking to move toward all source procurement. For a closer look at what we found in our report, let's go back to Lauren.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for walking us through those examples in more detail. On this next slide, I'm going to summarize where we've been and where we're going with resource procurement today as a foundation for defining what we mean when we say next generation procurement. So this illustrative diagram shows the stages of procurement transition. Fritz walked us through some of the history here, starting with the shift in the 1970s to today toward competitive procurement. So we see that in the transition from section 1 to 2 on this diagram. Right now, what we're seeing is that we're really at another juncture, moving from section 2 to 3 on this diagram, and we're really starting to see this broader market transition towards all source procurement, which is primarily focused on utility scale resources. So the examples that Carl just mentioned in El Paso particularly are examples of that. And we mentioned several other examples in the report as well. We're just at the very start of a final juncture here, moving from 3 to 4. Trying to understand how we build that optimal all source portfolio that also includes the demand side. Glendale introduced elements of that, as Carl mentioned, in purchasing demand side and distributed energy resources. One of the best practices that Carl just mentioned that's really still emerging is how to design a procurement process to not only capture the benefits of low cost utility scale renewable resources, but to also consider the opportunity for more demand side participation. But when we think about a modern future decarbonized electricity system, many of us have a vision of a system that also includes a robust and flexible demand side. So it's a procurement process that really addresses this need that goes beyond many of the processes, even that we're seeing characterized as all source today, that embodies what we mean when we refer to a next generation procurement process. So how do we build a process like this? We outlined the recipe for doing so to speak, in our report, summarized in this pyramid that I'm going to walk through briefly. So we start with the principles at the bottom of the pyramid, what we think of as a sort of North Star and how we might think about a next generation procurement process. The first principle that we mentioned, we've already discussed, is all source, which is really key. In order to make informed decisions about our future resource mix, we need to know the set of available options and capabilities with current pricing information. The next principle is objective aligned. This is really about understanding through our planning process and procurement process what we're designing and building for, or defining the needs and constraints on the resources that we're trying to buy. Are we trying to build a system that's resilient, for example? That needs to be reflected in the solicitation or the planning process that informs that. Are we trying to make sure the resources that we buy are aligned with state or utility carbon reduction targets? That needs to be reflected in the solicitation or in the planning process that informs that. In some cases, as Fritz mentioned, there may not actually be a reliability need for new resources to keep the lights on, but an opportunity to lower cost for all customers with new renewables. So those are the types of objectives that we refer to when we're thinking about how to design a process that is objective aligned. The final principle is least regrets. Procurement and planning right now is still largely in a paradigm of least cost, but in many cases, least cost doesn't adequately consider how quickly things are changing and the risk and uncertainty associated with some of the procurement decisions that we're making today. So moving up the pyramid onto foundational improvements to the process, this layer is really about what the process needs to look like in order to support that. So moving towards the next generation procurement process is actually quite complicated, and the utility themselves might not have all the answers. So engaging stakeholders, increasing transparency, and linking planning and procurement in a more robust way are actually really critical to making a process run smoothly. Engaging bidders, for example, before the solicitation is issued, can help ensure that we're not inadvertently excluding resources from the process. More traditional interveners like local stakeholder groups, environmental organizations, or industry interests can help to assess whether the solicitation is accurately reflecting policy goals, and can also be really helpful in identifying key risks. Finally, moving to the top of the pyramid, we talk about a set of activities that supports next generation procurement, defining the system need, scoping those fair and transparent RFP documents and process, and the selection of the actual optimal resource portfolio. So this is the core set of activities that we're seeing in a next generation procurement process, and we provide a lot of recommendations in the report for what good currently looks like for each of those elements. To summarize those, I'm going to hand it over to Carl to talk more about what's going well right now and what specific recommendations we have for what utilities and regulators can do to implement next generation procurement process.
Thanks, Lauren. The principles and best practice outcomes identified by Lauren can be pursued by regulators and utilities now with a few process improvements. So what I want to do as we wrap up this presentation portion of the webinar is to give you a few concrete recommendations, first for regulators and then for utilities. Near-term process improvements that regulators can begin implementing now include ensuring the evaluation criteria for selecting the optimal resource portfolio is aligned with public policy outcomes. As Lauren already alluded to, the public policy outcomes includes a broad range of outcomes that we have in mind here, including outcomes related to equity, renewables, decarbonization, and so forth. Secondly, ensure the need for new resources is well defined, transparent, and linked to findings from a well-vetted resource planning process. The third thing that you can do is to ensure that all resource providers have opportunities to offer all the capabilities their resources can provide from each of the resource options they bid. And finally, fourth, regulators can ensure that the bidding process is open, transparent, and evaluated fairly. Evaluation criteria used to select bids should be transparent and communicated clearly to bidders prior to bid submission deadlines. Now let's think about what utilities can do now. First of all, utilities can proactively bring a broad group of stakeholders, as Lauren described, a broad group of those who have interest from a consumer perspective, from a community, environmental perspective, and so forth, including those who have a financial interest like bidders and potential participants, third parties, and so forth. Bring in that broad group of stakeholders into the analysis of needs and defining the evaluation process for selecting portfolios. Secondly, use cost and operational data from actual competitive bids, not just internal estimates, to inform planning and procurement activities. And then third, work with bidders prior, during, and after solicitations to understand what data they need for them to give the best bids into the process. Thank you for listening today.
Great, that brings us to the end of the presentation section of this webinar. Thanks very much to Carl, Lauren, and Fritz. We're now going to have a question and answer segment from now until 3 p.m. Eastern time. But after that, all of us are actually going to stay on the line for an additional half hour until 3:30 p.m. Eastern. So we encourage you to stay on for the next hour and participate in the discussion. Again, you could submit questions by typing them into the question pane. So with that, let's turn to some questions that we have coming in. The first one I'll direct to Fritz, and it's a very practical question. How can you analyze, so you have 400 competing bids coming in, and you've got modeling software that produces only one optimized portfolio per scenario. How do you handle that, Fritz?
Well, so what a lot of utilities have discovered over the last few years is that when you, in these all source procurements, you can have multiple different configurations or multiple different sort of bids for the same project. So you can end up with a very, very large number of bids in your solicitation. And the way that you have to deal with this to reduce that number to a more tractable set of bids that you can actually evaluate using modeling is by doing some screening first. So most utilities will typically have a screening set where they'll reduce the number of bids down to a more manageable level. And then once they've reached that more manageable level, they'll either consolidate bids into portfolios and evaluate the portfolios, or evaluate bids individually.
Great, thanks. Another question for, I'll put out for all panelists to try. Can procurement practices become flexible to source for purpose and need and allow for technology optionality in responses?
I can go first. This is Carl. So yeah, procurement practices can become flexible to source for purpose and need. So I think about this as fundamentally being related to the solicitation being more granular or specific in defining what needs are required by the system. You know, for a long time, we just thought of evaluating alternatives based on energy and capacity, but actually, as the situation has evolved, perhaps we have more locational needs, perhaps we have particular resiliency needs, perhaps we have other operational capabilities other than energy and capacity alone, for example, a ramping capability. So to the extent that the procurement process can lay out, the procurement specification can lay out what the capabilities that are needed in a more granular way, then that gives bidders the opportunity to come in with solutions that might draw upon a whole range of resources. Of course, the second part of this is to allow those resources to bring the full range of capabilities that they can offer. So a good deal of flexibility is allowed if there's transparency on what the needs are, and if there is a great deal of flexibility in terms of how bidders can bring forward resources and their capabilities to propose to meet those needs.
Next question. Can you please describe if and how the ideas you're exploring will be particularly helpful to marginalized communities? And Lauren or Carl, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take this one, Max. Definitely. This is something that really relates to our principle of making sure that procurement is objective aligned. So many states and utilities right now are trying to understand, for example, the distributional impacts or economic development impacts of the resources that they're trying to buy. So from a content perspective, these are considerations that can be included as either qualitative or quantitative criteria for bid selection or assessed as a priority in the planning process. So we've seen solicitations in California, for example, that specify a certain percentage of distributed energy resources that need to be cited in what California defines as disadvantaged communities. The other relevant thing here is the process considerations that we lay out. So having a robust engagement process for procurement or for a planning process that's going to lead to procurement is pretty critical in ensuring that marginalized communities have a seat at the table in these conversations and can also share their own perspectives on what might be needed or prioritized in future resource procurement decisions.
Thanks. Well, another question to send your way, Lauren. This one on a quantitative question. What proportion of new utility capacity is currently obtained through competitive bidding? And what can you say about costs? I think you talked about this a little bit in the presentation, but it would be good to have any more detail you could provide.
Yeah, it's a good question, Max. I don't have an exact number, but I have some statistics that hopefully will give a flavor. And my other panelists should feel free to chime in if they have an exact number in mind. To put things in perspective, currently in the US, we see just over half of generating capacity owned by vertically integrated utilities. We have Texas, Illinois, and the majority of states in the Northeast that are all primarily within market footprints. So they are kind of inherently using a competitive process for their generation. In our report, we outline what the opportunity looks like for these vertically integrated utilities out to 2030. When we look at projected load growth, potential from electrification and retirement of uneconomic fossil fuel plants, and what we need to meet state and utility climate targets, we see about 420 gigawatts of procurement over the next decade, just by vertically integrated utilities. So today we only have 2 states that require utilities to take an all-source approach. There are about 12 more states that have a requirement for competitive procurement for all resources. And we have a few states that have a limited competitive procurement process just for renewables. So some states across the 10 gigawatts of investments that we highlighted in our paper that have been procured through all source procurement processes, those aren't comprehensive, not the full story even of what's just been procured in all source procurement, but a good, robust subset. There's also several utilities that take a competitive approach without a state level requirement, so those would need to be factored in as well.
Okay, lots of questions coming in here. This one for Fritz. Should end-of-life management considerations for, I think the question means for a power plant that's getting near retirement, be a part of the procurement process? And the questioner singles out developer plans for repurposing or recycling. Fritz?
If I understand the question correctly, I think the answer is yes, but the idea is that the developer, in a competitive process, the developer is either the developer is taking responsibility for what happens at end of life and can resubmit the project in a new solicitation, or the utility, the regulatory framework that's governing what the utility is doing is encouraging the utility to make end-of-life decisions that reflect what's going on in the marketplace. I think the short answer is yes.
I'm going to bundle together a set of diverse questions we're getting that are essentially about specific resource types and how specific resources fit into procurement practices. We have at least one questioner who's asking about storage, long duration or multi-day storage. Another asks about hydrogen and ammonia as fuels. We also have requests for more information on how distributed resources fit into procurement? We have an audience member who has a strong interest in hydro resources. So let me just ask actually a broader question for the panel. You've talked a lot about making the procurement process open to lots of different resource options. Do you have any additional thoughts about considerations as new resource options and new technologies continue to emerge and to decline in costs? And do any specific resources, such as, say, hydro generation, need specific consideration? Fritz, you want to start on this?
Sure. I think Lauren made this point earlier that it's really critical that developers and utilities are communicating about what the utilities need from developers to be able to accurately evaluate their bids in an all-source solicitation. So, for instance, with long-duration storage, you know, the costs will look a lot more like shorter duration storage, but the capabilities in terms of the both duration and operate and how the facility is actually getting operated may look very different from short duration storage. And it's important that the developers and utilities are communicating about what both the operating parameters and how to best evaluate these kinds of resources in resource evaluation. So the same is true with new hydro. I think the limitation on new hydro is probably more regulatory than it is resource per se.
Let me continue along on that resource specific line of questions and pose this one from one audience member about energy efficiency. If energy efficiency is as cheap as we all believe it is, why, the questioner asks, is it not very successful in all source procurement? And the questioner mentions that Washington State has had all source procurement requirements for more than 20 years, and energy efficiency remains a non-player. Carl, do you want to try that one?
Sure. So, first of all, to the extent that energy efficiency is able to come into being through programs, then we see it showing up in the definition of need. So it's not that it's not contributing to the ultimate solution, but that it just doesn't initially appear. However, above and beyond that, it's quite reasonable to ask, well, perhaps energy efficiency bundled with storage and distributed resources could be providing some of these capabilities that are called for in a solicitation. Think particularly of local resource needs. Suppose there is a particular place on the grid where there's system stress and there's the need for resources to address that system stress. It's very likely that energy efficiency, incremental energy efficiency, above and beyond what has already been obtained through programs, could be part of a least cost solution. I think the problem and why we don't see that happening very often is there's not an opening for energy efficiency and for other resources that are a less traditional part of a procurement to demonstrate their capabilities. That's why I think one of the key parts in making for a good procurement process is to ensure that resource providers have the opportunity to demonstrate how their resource, perhaps in combination with other resources, can meet the needs and to give them a basis for then bidding on it. I think in many cases, energy efficiency never even gets to the table of that competition because there isn't that opportunity to demonstrate how it can be a complementary resource to others that can produce a least cost bid solution.
Wanted to add can I add a little bit on that? So it is definitely true that in all source solicitations of, outside of California potentially, There's been very little procurement, little to no procurement of demand side resources more broadly. And what procurement there has been individual demand response projects. This is like this question over whether energy efficiency should participate through competitive solicitations or through programs has been a 20-30 year debate. The reason why there was an argument that it should be in programs rather than competitive solicitations was because energy efficiency tends to have high transaction costs. Meaning, if you're an energy efficiency provider, you have to go out and recruit costs. But in a competitive solicitation, you're being asked to make a bid to the utility and maintain the validity of that bid for multiple, potentially even multiple years. So that's just a really, really tall order for a lot of energy efficiency providers. But I will say that the capabilities of both the kinds of resources that energy efficiency providers are able to provide and the capabilities that they have now have evolved over the last 10 years. And so I did a report recently for LBNL on all source competitive solicitations, and most of the interest from industry in that report was actually from energy efficiency providers. So I do think there's an opportunity to try to think about how to best bring energy efficiency back into competitive solicitations, realizing that a big chunk of it will still be in programs.
Let me ask a follow-up question. Are any utilities doing a good job of recognizing the transmission and distribution savings in particular associated with energy efficiency, distributed solar, and demand response, and how did they do it? Fritz or Carl or Lauren, I'll throw it out to any of you.
So the question was how do you incorporate the avoided transmission costs in evaluating distributed resources?
Yes, and if you have any examples of that, but principles are good.
So I can't think of an example offhand, but the idea would be that you try to figure out where areas when you're capacity constrained on the transmission system, meaning times when and places where you would be avoiding transmission upgrades, and then figure out how to incorporate them into your resource evaluations. The reality, though, is with locational marginal pricing for the transmission system, with locational marginal pricing and with zonal resource adequacy, you're capturing two big elements of avoided transmission costs right there. And so the remaining piece, this reliability ISO piece, is likely to be a little bit smaller. But there are examples of utilities that are doing this. I think SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, has a long history of looking into this topic, so they'd be a good place to start for people who are interested.
And just to add to that, Max, I think when we start getting into the transmission and distribution system value piece and defining the need there, we enter into the realm of non-wires alternatives or non-wire solutions, of which we've seen many all-source competitive solicitations to meet that need, just kind of by another name or of a different flavor than some of these large, more resource adequacy oriented procurements that we covered in today's presentation. So the New York utilities, for example, have run many competitive solicitations for meeting distribution system needs.
Okay, shift gears a little bit here. There's a question asking for an example of a public process that we can point to for successful engagement from community and environmental justice groups. Lauren, I think you answered a related question earlier, so maybe I'll give you the first chance at this one.
Yeah, thanks, Max. We outlined the full process of competitive procurement in 3 jurisdictions in the report that are probably worth looking at. The first is Excel in Colorado. We look at NIPSCO's process in Northern Indiana, and we look at the process in Glendale. And all of those processes look slightly different and varied in formality. In Colorado, it's a formally docketed process, so interveners can participate and submit comments, and the commission is the main arbiter of those. In Glendale and NIPSCO, the process was more utility-led and informal, but really what it looked like was a series of public meetings at various stages in the procurement process. So what's really critical, or what we outlined as really critical in that process, is having at least one of those prior to the solicitation being released. Historically, we've seen a lot of processes simply offer kind of a Q&A session after the solicitation is released, but when we're talking about this kind of complex all-source process that requires taking in information from a lot of new and different resources, having those touch points in making sure that the need is clearly defined, which is where I could see a lot of the community and environmental justice groups having a strong voice, and that we are creating criteria for the solicitation that do assess some of those distributional values, if those are prioritized in the state as well, is really critical. And all of that would happen before the solicitation is released.
Now I'd like to paraphrase the next question. I think it's fair to say it's about what might be called regulatory capture, and the idea that PUCs might not always follow best practices. I don't know if there's any easy answers to this type of question, but I will offer the panel a chance to say something about this question. Carl, do you want to have the first?
Yeah, sure. I don't mind. Yeah. So look, I think the public interest underlies the obligation of public utility commissioners in their decision-making process. And so I think that ensuring that you broaden the frame to include all the elements of public interest that are encompassed within or affected by the decision that the commission will make is really important. So some utility commissioners may be predisposed to favor certain solutions or to have favorite technologies, or to maybe not think broadly about the public interest as they are charged to do. So, but I would say that bringing in the public interest obligation of the commission, bringing in the differences in portfolios in terms of how they meet broader public interest objectives. For example, there may be certain portfolios that address resilience needs at lower cost, or that provide more flexibility that can be adapted, maybe not as big of a sunk cost in a less flexible technology, but a cost that can be, that's invested in some combination of demand flexibility that can then be applied to fit needs as they evolve over time. Because one thing that we definitely see now is that needs are evolving, and not always in predictable ways. So I think bringing that out, making sure that the capabilities of the technologies to address that broader set of public interest objectives puts that commissioner who may be predisposed to focus on one metric or one technology in the position of having to be confronted with the fact that their choice is inferior on certain dimensions of public interest performance.
next question goes to what we called in the presentations, we called evaluation criteria. And the questioner is asking for some examples of evaluation criteria, particularly, for example, should capacity factor be considered? Should the ability to generate power for a certain amount of time without grid support be considered? How about ancillary services? And so on. Fritz, do you want to try this one?
Sure. So I think the first line of this is probably that the criteria that utilities are using to evaluate resources should be aligned with whatever goals the commission has set for the utility. So that could be things like cost, could be things like affordability, will definitely include reliability, and will probably these days will include emissions and state goal, environmental goal, more broadly state environmental goals. But the way that utilities can then approach this is they can evaluate resources in terms of how do they perform against these different metrics. What I think is a little bit tricky, and I would caution against, is starting to include a lot of engineering type metrics in the way that utilities evaluate resources. So for instance, I'm not sure that it's that wise to include things like ramping needs as a metric for how utilities evaluate resources, because in some ways these types of needs are going to be embedded in economic trade-offs that utilities are going to have to make between resources. So for instance, is a resource that's operating at a really low capacity factor economic? Well, it depends more broadly on the reliability and cost metrics that you set. It may actually be economic to have these resources that operate at low capacity factors, or to have storage resources, for instance, that we curtail quite a bit just to meet cost and reliability needs. So my personal view of this is that defining those high level metrics and then giving utilities the flexibility to choose the portfolio that best meets those metrics is a better way to do this, rather than trying to define 20 or 30 different types of metrics that utilities should be trying to plan around.
Yeah, just to add to that too, and build on what Fritz just said, I think the portfolio approach is something that's really emerging here as well. So not even necessarily thinking about the set of screening criteria to narrow down the subset of bids that go into modeling, and then actually evaluating not just individual bids, but what a portfolio of bids might be able to do with respect to the types of metrics that are important to the procurement.
Well, we're now just about at the 1 hour mark. This has been a great discussion so far. I'd like to invite the audience to stay online if you can. Our team is going to be available right now for another half hour to continue answering questions. We do have quite a few questions coming in. For those that need to leave, I'll remind you to watch out for details we'll be sending soon about our follow-up webinar in the next month or two. And with that, let me turn to the next question. Are there any examples of good best practice rules for choosing independent evaluators and assigning them a scope of work? Anyone want to go for that?
Yeah, I can take that on. The short answer is yes, but it's not this. The best practices part of this has not been done systematically. So I believe there's some discussion, Lauren and Carl, correct me if I'm wrong, about this in the RMI report. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab also supported a report that I worked on that talks about the use of that describes some examples of both the roles and responsibilities of independent evaluators in all source procurement processes. But there hasn't been, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any systematic study of looking across jurisdictions of what the decisions and best practices around independent evaluators would be. But I think that's a great idea.
Do you have any recommendations about when bid information, including pricing, should be made public for comparison purposes. Carl, is this?
Sure. So can you hear me, Max?
Yes.
Okay. So it's understandable that there's competitive sensitivity to bids proximate to the time of bid, but you know, following after some amount of cooling off, some period has passed from the bid. My understanding is that Colorado requires disclosure 18 months after the bid is submitted. So, you know, I think comparing that to more immediate disclosure of bids is in my opinion, a sensitive question. And I guess I haven't myself really landed on that. So I do think that ultimately disclosing bids is a good idea. But I open it up to my fellow panelists to see if either of them have landed on what they think, whether they think there's an optimal kind of time frame for releasing bid information.
So my take on this would be if there's any possibility for developers to change their bids, or for the utility to change its proposals in the solicitation, then cost should be the confidentiality of bids should be maintained. But then once that period's over, so for instance in Colorado, after roughly a year and a half, then there should be it's useful to make the bids an anonymized version of the results of the bids public, and it's part of the reason that I think it's important to make that public is that there should be this interactive relationship between what utilities are discovering through competitive procurement and the values that they're using in their resource plans. So if those values aren't public, then it's really hard to use them in resource plans. So at some point, it's really useful to make those bids public, or at least a redacted, or an even better, an aggregated version of those bids public, or of the bid results public.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add to that, is that we've seen a lot of aggregate or median bids released, and those are also quite useful. And another reason why they're useful is just for pure utilities and other state regulators to have a good sense of where the market is at. Generally, the bids in Colorado have been particularly valuable in really making clear the prices and where the prices were at in the West.
This next question is based on an observation from one of our audience members, that sometimes there are procurement processes that are, at least on the surface, they're technology neutral, but in reality they have some conditions that tend to favor gas peaking plants, even though, as the questioner puts it, those are uneconomic. And do we have any advice for dealing with this kind of procurements that might actually be tilted in that direction? Lauren, do you want to try this one?
Yeah, definitely. This really relates to kind of the second recommendation in the top of the pyramid, I think, that I outlined around how you can actually write the solicitation in a way that is fair and transparent. We've seen a lot of solicitations that are pseudo all source, but are really only seeking firm generating capacity, for example, without a clear need for that resource or that particular type of resource. So the two ways that we think about this in the paper are, one, making sure that the need is defined accurately. So not necessarily describing the need in terms of firm generation capacity needed, but describing how much capacity, when, what time and for how long, and really getting clear on the reliability concerns can help open that up to a broader set of resources. The second is, again, this bidder and stakeholder engagement piece. Stakeholders can be really helpful in identifying the types of language within a solicitation that are likely to bias it towards one resource or another.
Maybe just to add something onto that. So I think a lot of utilities historically have binned resources before the solicitation starts. So meaning that you bin your dispatchable, non-dispatchable, et cetera, resources before the solicitation starts. And then you say, I need 300 megawatts of dispatchable resources and 100 megawatts of non-dispatchable. And the idea with the technology neutral solicitation is you just say, you know, I need 300 megawatts of capacity resources, and maybe I need some energy depending on how low your bids are. But then the only binning that's happening is happening after the solicitation in terms of how you write contracts. You're not actually using the bins to filter resources at the beginning of the solicitation. Otherwise, it's not really all source.
Let me follow up on that. Another questioner asks, but aren't there cases where you need peaking dispatchable resources, and how do you handle that?
Well, but the way that the evaluation of different resources for whether they're able to meet your need should be done is through modeling rather than through kind of rules of thumb going into the solicitation. So for instance, to what extent can you displace a gas combustion turbine with a combination of solar and storage? It kind of depends. And it depends on things that you'll only be able to tell once you actually evaluate resources in the bid evaluation process, not sort of in terms of ex ante screens.
I'll just add here too, especially on the topic of firm dispatchable capacity, certainly there is a need for energy at certain times that utilities may identify in their modeling. And part of ensuring that resources beyond just gas can compete in meeting that need is making sure that storage is adequately valued and modeled as well.
And I would also just like to jump in briefly. While I agree with Fritz made a comment earlier about not wanting to have 20 or 40 different capabilities or criteria for comparing bids with each other. I think the historical practice has been to limit it to capacity and energy only, and then as Fritz just said, there's some implicit needs that are buried within there that when you start digging in, in the post screening process and digging in, there's some implicit discrimination if you haven't conveyed to the potential bidders what the nature of the need is. So in my opinion, providing enough granularity on what capabilities are really needed, as well as a limited set of criteria against which you're going to evaluate those bids is important. And unfortunately, without that kind of upfront transparency, then bidders are left with some vagueness about what's going to be valued in their bid. That's why I think one of the principles we talk about in the paper is ensuring that there's interaction with potential bidders beforehand to make sure that there's as good an understanding as possible of what the underlying need is, and also that there's an interaction where the bidders have the opportunity to demonstrate that their product, perhaps in combination with others as a portfolio, is able to deliver certain needs.
Now we have a couple of questions about the concept that came up in the presentations about least regrets versus least cost. And there's a request for a bit more information about what that means in practice, and also how do you encourage a movement from the tendency to look at choices in terms of least cost and move to least regrets. Lauren?
Yeah, it's a great question, Max. I think the key element that we think of when we think about least regrets is incorporating an analysis of uncertainty and of some of the stochastic analysis of uncertainty into evaluation of bids and evaluation of the resources that a utility is considering procuring. This is something that's become pretty standard in a planning process, but often isn't carried over into the procurement process when actually evaluating bids and thinking about what the lifetime of those resources might be, fuel costs, and other components that might impact ratepayers moving forward. The second thing we think about is the action plan, so to speak, or what you actually choose to procure after you've received the bids, and thinking about that in a mindset of what can I procure now with no regrets is often is a tactic that we've seen several utilities take. So this also relates back to thinking about where there's an economic need instead of a reliability need. If you're getting record low prices in your procurement, but don't necessarily need to procure that much energy in the short term, it might be worth it to procure more solar, for example, if you're seeing record low prices.
Oh, if I could just give one, I agree with everything that Lauren just said. But one kind of specific way where least cost may lead you wrong is if you don't consider a range of possible futures, if you don't consider the key uncertainties, then you may identify a least cost portfolio or least cost outcome that is in fact least cost on kind of a mean modal basis. However, there may be certain future plausible combinations of events under which that portfolio performs very poorly. So since we're operating at a time when there is significant uncertainty, how a portfolio performs under a range of plausible futures and perhaps might be a least cost solution under some more extreme conditions, but which are plausible, might mitigate against choosing the mean modal least cost that performs kind of well on average, but does not avoid the vulnerability, which could be a very severe vulnerability under particular futures. So when I think of least regrets versus least cost, I'm thinking about considering how uncertainty and how our uncertain view of what is going to evolve in the coming decade and coming 2 decades requires that we consider not only what performs best on average, but what protects us against really bad outcomes.
One questioner asks, how do you consider different development timelines in solicitation and evaluation? For example, it may be that offshore wind and pumped storage hydro projects might need a solicitation with a long time frame. The questioner is suggesting that they've heard about a request for a more than 10-year time frame, whereas obviously other resources, I think the implication here is other resources can have a much shorter development timeline. Fritz?
So typically the solicitation will be some number, the process through which this is happening is that the utility is identifying a need and announcing a solicitation, and that solicitation will be some amount of years in front of the actual need, but it'll be for a window. Maybe that window is 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, and that the utility can identify solutions within that time period. What this would suggest then is that potentially for projects that require much longer lead times, that utilities would need to incorporate that into how they're evaluating resources. So for instance, if it takes 3-4 years to 5 years to build an offshore wind project, that the utility would need to incorporate that into its comparison of different resources and potential solutions.
A question about social procurement policies. Can you think of any examples of social procurement policies that have been included in recent procurement exercises?
What is a social procurement policy?
We don't have specification. If this doesn't ring a bell to anybody, I'll move on to the next question.
Oh, I mean, we could think about, we could think about meeting specific needs that are. I think of, we're talking more about large scale procurements, but I'm thinking about resiliency events, recovery from events where you need to put out a solicitation, and there's certain communities that are perhaps more impacted, and so there's some special effort to incorporate a weighting in the procurement to address the needs of certain communities. That's all but I'm not sure if that's what the questioner is asking about.
Yeah, just to add to that, another angle on social procurement policies, so to speak, we cover an example of the San Juan generating station replacement in New Mexico in our paper, and one of the key considerations there, which is a consideration we've seen show up more and more, is economic development. So actually specifying that a certain quantity of resources need to be located within a certain area in order to replace a tax base for a retiring resource, for example. So that's another way, in addition to some of the resilience considerations Carl mentioned, that we've seen some of these more social and economic policies show up in procurement.
In Colorado, also, the Colorado PUC also is a good example of a commission that embeds economic development and kind of larger social justice issues into its requirements for how utilities procure resources.
We have a question. You discussed metrics like capacity factor and ramping. Aren't these simply inputs to the model for each resource, and the model optimizes a portfolio that includes analysis of these metrics within the model? Who'd like to take that?
Yeah, I'll take it. I think the short answer is, yeah, the capacity factor won't be an input per se, but it'll be an output. But the short answer is yes, these things, all these different parameters will get optimized in the model.
To what degree are regulators factoring electrification into their requirements for utility modeling of future need?
Great question. And I think this varies a lot across jurisdictions and in terms of what the best way to do this is, because the effect of electrification on load shapes will depend on a lot of assumptions about, for instance, how EVs charge. So how to incorporate these assumptions into load growth that goes into resource planning and needs identification is a really, really tricky issue. And there's different examples, for instance, from California to New York about how to best do this in a way that adheres to this least risk principle, but also at the same time enables a realistic assessment of where load growth is going to be and what the magnitude of it might be and what to do if it doesn't show up.
We have a question about keeping utility scale bids and DER bids on a level playing field. And in particular, this questioner is wondering, can or should commercial guarantees such as liquidated damages be made equivalent between utility scale bids and DER bids? Lauren, is this something that you want to take a shot at, or others?
Software's starting to talk. If you want to,
I can do it. So there's the backstory for this is there's a lot of requirements on for project timelines for when as a project you're achieving commercial operation, when you're achieving specific milestones, and there may be penalties attached to those that would be excessively punitive for smaller projects. I don't know of any commissions that have given a lot of thought to how to make these more project milestones and incentives more commensurate between distribution and transmission level resources. But I think that's a really interesting and worthwhile area of inquiry.
That's something that's a comment, but I think it can be fashioned into kind of questions. One audience member is noting that rapid technology cost declines. I think the ideas for wind and solar, according to this audience members, are as much due to the presence of incentives for new wind and solar, while new and existing hydro don't have incentives and thus are sidelined. Do you have any views on how to think about these kinds of comparisons and how such incentives enter into the process? Carl, do you want to try this one?
Okay, I think while it's certainly true that incentives have supported faster rates of adoption than might have occurred otherwise for certain technologies that are more, at the beginning of their deployment. So, but a lot of the rapid cost decline in solar is due to scale and experience. And so, while the incentives may have been very important at the beginning, I wouldn't say they're as important now to providing comparative advantage relative to other technologies. But it's certainly true that there are incentives. Whether the incentives are fairly set politically for those resources that could contribute to meeting social goals, such as decarbonization, is something that people should argue about. I mean, if they feel that they have a lower cost, superior solution, then that's for decarbonizing, then that's a appropriate argument in the political arena where those incentives are often determined.
And with that, we're getting close to the end of the time we have available. I'd like to thank Lauren, Carl, and Fritz, and I'd like to give Carl a few minutes to recap some of the main points and offer some thoughts to sum up this webinar. Carl?
Yeah, thanks, Max. I just want to go back to our basic recommendations. We've had a wide-ranging conversation, and so we have, we had a series of recommendations for regulators. Next bullet, please. So we first talked about ensuring evaluation criteria for selecting the optimal resource portfolios are aligned with public policy outcomes. We talked about that a good bit. Ensure that the need for new resources is well defined, transparent, and linked to findings from well-vetted resource planning process. Third, we recommend that regulators ensure that all resource providers have the opportunity to offer all the capabilities of their resource options into bid. And fourth, that we ensure that the bidding process is open, transparent, and evaluated fairly. That evaluation criteria used to select bids are transparent and communicated clearly prior to bid submission deadlines. And then we had a few recommendations for utilities. First of all, to proactively bring in a wide range of stakeholders into the analysis of needs and defining the evaluation process early on. Secondly, to use cost and operational data from competitive bids, not just internal estimates, to perform planning and procurement activities. And third, we recommend the utilities work with bidders prior to, during, and after solicitations to understand what data that they need to have for the bidders to give their best bids. So with that, we hope you enjoy our two publications. We guide you back to those links that Donna shared early on. Thank you for joining us today, and please reach out if you'd like to talk more.
Thank you all very much, and we'll be sending information about a follow-up webinar that we are planning in the next month or two at a date to be decided. Thank you, everybody. That ends our webinar today.